first question, like, who are you and what have you done so far? Who is Austin Wintory?
I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that. Well, obviously, I'm a composer. I think that's I'm privileged. I believe very much to be joining the ranks of other composers on your site and that you've spoken with in the past. I saw some friends and colleagues there, and I have primarily earned my living doing video games the last 10 to 15 years or so. I also do little bits of everything, I suppose: film, television, stage works, concert music, working on a musical, all the above. But video games is certainly, I think, where my reputation lives and where I've had a lot of really wonderful opportunities over the years.
Wow, I'm a big Jerry Goldsmith fan, so I've
Oh,
read
yes.
with enthusiasm that his music brought you to composing. Especially nice that it wasn't one of his standard scores like Star Trek, but yeah, A Patch of Blue. Do you see the movie and fall in love with the music?
Funny enough, to this day, I've still never seen that film.
Wow. Oh, me too.
It's a strange thing. Jerry is a very unique composer.
Mhm.
Insofar as he was so prolific, he wrote so many scores that it would probably be impossible to see all of the films. And the thing is, so many of them are long forgotten because most were just not that great. And Patch of Blue, my understanding is, of course, that it is actually an exception. It's a rather beautiful film. And you mentioned Star Trek, which is kind of controversial, but I like it, and I certainly love all of his Star Trek scores, particularly the original, the motion picture. But the list just goes on, and the number of classics that he's scored is large, but not anything near compared with the number of just horrible films that he's done. So I've seen tons of films that he scored, but somehow not that one. But for me, among the very first that I discovered right alongside A Patch of Blue is a film I've seen multiple times, which is Patton. And that for me is essentially a perfect score. There's not one inch or millimeter or single 30-second note that I could imagine changing about that score. To me, it's film music perfection.
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, my favorites are the Joe Dante movies like Gremlins and Small Soldiers. So yeah, I love these scores and my collection with them with them. So yeah.
Yeah, you can't go wrong. I mean, funny enough, I often label Patton as the perfect score, but my favorite Goldsmith is probably The Wind and the Lion. But yeah, I mean, Gremlins. How could you go wrong? A couple years ago, just maybe 2-3 years ago, I worked with a filmmaker who had written the screenplay to Small Soldiers before he became a director. And I told him, when he reached out to me and said, are you interested in scoring my film? I said, absolutely yes, and I don't even care what your movie's about because I just am happy to work with anybody that worked, even if indirectly, with Jerry.
Mm-hmm.
He thought that was very funny. Ended up being a fantastic movie that he ended up being like this film was called The Last Movie Star, and it was Burt Reynolds' final film. But I didn't even going into it. I didn't care. I was just excited to work with someone who had been part of the Goldsmith legacy.
Mm-hmm. Wow! And had you ever the opportunity to meet him or go to a concert?
No, he died before I moved to LA. Literally the summer before I moved was the summer that he died, and I had tickets to see him conduct in Nashville and was going to fly out to see him, and he canceled the ticket. They canceled the concert due to health, and this was maybe 3 or 4 months before he died, and then he was gone. So in a way, I'm grateful I never met him because he's always been sort of like this god to me, and now he gets to stay that way. Whereas, for example, when I was 16, I got to meet John Williams for the first time, and it made him very much a man and not a god. And that was very empowering for me because I thought, wow, there's actually no fundamental difference between he and I. He's, of course, very talented, and he's had some wonderful opportunities that he capitalized on incredibly. But he's not inhuman. I can do this. I'm also human. It was very empowering as a kid to meet him and realize that he really is just as human as I am, even if he is a superstar. But Jerry never got subjected to that, so he remains this kind of deist, this film music deity.
Wow. Yeah, and how continued it then when for you to fulfill your dream to work as a composer, so like your musical education?
For me, it was always self-propelled. I was very excited about this whole thing, and so I just wrote music for fun for myself. I worked with my school orchestra in high school, and just anything that they could teach me, I wanted to learn. And then once I, knew that this was absolutely what I was going to be doing, I I started to pursue, college. I went to NYU initially in New York City, and then to USC in Los Angeles to get composition degrees, and was working on student projects and things like that all along the way.
Mm-hmm.
So it was always, I did go get, an actual education in this subject, but my goal was always to just do it, and so I didn't wait for the degree or anything like that. It was just like dive in at full speed.
What was your first project, and are you still proud of it?
I don't think I'm proud of even my most recent project.
Yeah.
I always find all these things I wish I had done differently immediately, but I mean, but I'm not ashamed either. And
Good.
my first project, my first commercial, true, publicly released project, in terms of video games, was that game company's debut title called Flow, which we did initially as a student project in 2006, and then we were kind of hired to remake it by Sony as an early PS3 title in 2007, and so that was my first real project. Before that had done student projects, and I was also scoring independent feature films, and I had my first film play at the Sundance Film Festival around that time as well, which was kind of my simultaneous first foray into the bigger world of movies. But yeah, Flow was the first, and Flow, it's funny because it remains very unlike almost everything I've done since then. Flow is very atmospheric to an extreme. It almost pathologically avoids melody, for example, which is something I usually try to work very hard to make reasonably good about my projects. I'm a believer in the power of melody, but Flow is designed to be kind of like this just waves of atmosphere. It's also very interactive and in a very mechanical kind of way, which is something I tend to also avoid in my game scores. I prefer interactive scores to be sort of character or narratively driven and not just mindlessly based around the character sort of pushing buttons. But this one is almost like a giant musical toy where everything that you do has to trigger musical responses. And so it was an unusual game in every way. So yeah, I mean, I'm not ashamed of it. I just conducted for a audience of, I don't know, a good-sized audience, 1,500 people or something, in Poland just 2 weeks ago, a kind of retrospective of a lot of my music over the last period of my career, and Flow was even in there. So I guess I'm not ashamed of it. But yeah, that was the first, and it did very well. It was surprising. It was kind of a surprise hit, and it got the ball rolling and sort of got my name out there to some folks and opened up opportunities. Although it was reuniting with that game company a couple years later on their third game, Journey, which completely blew the roof off of my opportunities up to then.
I didn't know Journey. Yeah. I'm a gamer myself. So I was more surprised how successful the score was. Grammy nomination, highest chart position of a video game score. Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you. It was
can
surreal.
you still remember the work or the music?
What? How do you mean?
Like, do you have special moments that you always remember, or what was your approach for that?
Oh, well, yes, endlessly. I mean, I could go on and on and on and on. It was 3 years of writing, so it was it was a lot of work. It started on Journey about 10 years ago, so it was early 2009, more than 10 years ago, that began the score, and spent all the way up until the release in March or so of 2012. And so, I mean, every single cue was written and rewritten and rewritten and rewritten. And not because I was getting, huge amounts of feedback and being told try it again, but because, I was just trying to keep pace with the game. And every time they were updating the game, I would find all these inspiring new bits. And so I would constantly rewrite the music just to keep up. And it was an amazing experience. I got to work with one of my favorite musicians in the world, a dear friend for a long time, Tina Guo, this sort of superstar cellist, and she's kind of the heart and soul of the score. So everything was built around her playing. It's so hard to generalize about it. It was an incredible experience. I will say that in terms of specific memories, the finale of the game, the big what we on the soundtrack refer to as apotheosis, but it's a series of cues that are all kind of woven around what the player is doing in the finale. That was probably the single most difficult because we all knew that the ending of the game, from a gameplay perspective and from a musical perspective, was not satisfying enough. It wasn't working, and so we kept making new version after new version after new version, and finally, one day I just kind of gave up and came into my studio on some Sunday afternoon and just sat down and started writing, and I wasn't looking at the game. I wasn't thinking about the artwork or the movement or any of that sort of thing. I just thought, I'm just going to write. I'm just going to compose in this very kind of isolated way and just not worry. And somehow this piece came out of that release, and it was one of those odd things where I sat back and listened to it, and I thought, I've been struggling, and then somehow this just kind of flowed out of me, and I don't have any explanation for that. I sent it to the team, and I said, I don't want to sound overly optimistic, but I think I may have found it. And they responded similarly, like, yeah, it seems maybe that could work, and tinkered with it a little bit, but basically just put it straight into the game. And then ironically, that has been by far the most popular piece of music from the score. And it's just it's been performed by orchestras all over the world constantly in the years since, and it's got a zillion hits on YouTube and all that kind of thing, and it was one of those that it was just, I was pulling my teeth trying to get it right, and then I didn't believe it, I didn't trust it that I had it, but we kind of ran out of time. And so it's part of that mysteriousness of how this stuff works. You never really can figure out which is going to really stick.
Wow. I found a list that Journey is a game with a great world. So in the list like Assassin's Creed or Horizon Zero Dawn, and I saw the picture. Whoa, yeah. So it's definitely on my list.
Yeah, well, it's worth checking out. I mean, the game is just exceptionally beautiful. It's a true masterpiece that they made. I've never, especially up to that point, I had never played a game anything at all like it, and it's inspired many games since then. But it still stands rather alone, I think. And I felt like I had the front row seat to watching them make something truly extraordinary, and not get to take credit for it. The music plays an important role, but they very much made the game. I don't get to pretend that was me, and as a result, I get to go on and on about how genius I think they are.
Oh. Yeah, on the list, Journey was compared to Abzu, also a game which I don't know yet, but to which you also wrote the music. What can you tell me about it?
Well, Abzu, in many ways, is kind of what we refer to as a spiritual successor. It's not a sequel by any means, but it is crafted from a similar mindset. The game's creative director was the art director on Journey, as well as that game company's previous game to Journey called Flower. And I think he's pretty unquestionably the best artist in the game industry, visual artist. He has an incredible understanding of art and games and how to really make something shine. One of the things that I love about the game industry is that there really is no shortage of talent, and he I say that knowing that there are many, many, many phenomenal artists, but he to me is just quite special. And I felt very lucky that after Journey came out, he started his own company and asked me to be part of the next great adventure that he was embarking upon. And so Abzu is it all takes place underwater, and it is similar to Journey. It's very kind of explorational and experiential. There are not any of the traditional game mechanics like, points or high scores or extra lives or health meters and damage bars and all that kind of stuff. It has none of that. It is purely just navigating through a jaw-droppingly beautiful environment and letting the environment tell you its story. And so the idea for all of us was how can we take similar sorts of mechanics as Journey but tell a very, very different story. And so the sound of the score ended up being quite distinct from Journey. It is, whereas Journey is a lot of isolated and sort of lonely cello solos with some subtle string orchestra that emerges over time. This one is very heavily choral based. There's a lot of choir in the score. There's also a lot of I did a large harp ensemble with 7 harps that form kind of the spine of the score as well. And the central soloist is an oboe played by the wonderful Kristen Nagus, who I'd worked with. This was our first time working together on that one, but we've worked together a million times since then. And then there's also a kind of a lush orchestral component to it as well. But the choir and the harps and the oboe form the kind of the nucleus, which is a very different palette from Journey, and intentionally so. It's far more sort of ethereal and hopefully otherworldly, whereas Journey is almost religious in a way. Great. If any of that makes sense.
I think so.
Well, I'm trusting you.
I've also listened to the music of Tooth and Tail. This is really a wonderful and crazy music.
Thank you.
Where did you get the inspiration for such music?
So, Tooth and Tail is, the answer to where I got the inspiration is the same as if you asked me about any other project. It's always, I try to draw my inspiration from the project itself. And Tooth and Tail is, jokingly, I like to think of it as, the George Orwell book Animal Farm. It's sort of Animal Farm, the video game, because it's this very darkly funny study of these animals forming a society and kind of fighting out a war to decide the food chain once and for all. And it's essentially like whoever loses is dinner kind of idea. And so it's a strategy game it's a real-time strategy game in the vein of some of the classics in that genre, like Warcraft, 2 and 3 particularly, or Command and Conquer. And you play it, but you play it with a controller, which, not to get very sort of gamer technical with you, but traditionally strategy games have always been computer games, not console games like a PlayStation or an Xbox, because the keyboard and mouse, they usually require some pretty sophisticated controls that you need all the keys of a regular computer keyboard, and also the instant responsiveness of a mouse. And the creator of Tooth and Tail, a guy named Andy Schatz, with whom I'd worked before, said he wanted to try to figure out how to make strategy games fit on a console, because he likes playing video games on his couch and not at his desk. But you need to be able to adapt the controls to a controller, which is a tall order. So that was kind of his fundamental goal. But he dressed it up in this wonderful Orwellian kind of dark Animal Farm or Redwall or Secret of Nim kind of vibe. And but there's a very Slavic quality to it. It has a very kind of Russian Revolution vibe to it. Obviously, the Orwell thing is tied in with that. And so I thought it would be fun to lean heavily into that, where the music is sort of drawing on Slavic folk traditions. But then on top of that, he and I were talking and said, engaging in battle is like dancing, and it should feel like a dance. And so we started talking, well, what if all of the different characters that you can control have their own sort of characteristic dance? And that ends up being the basis for the score. So, for example, we have the sort of the military characters, the KSR or the military police. This is one of the factions you can control. And so I thought, what if they have a very pompous military brass band waltz, this kind of boom, 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 with, big fat tuba bass line kind of thing. And in contrast to that, you have the clergy, the sort of the religiously ordained sort of high society parts of the world that I gave this sort of odd pipe organ tango to. And then there's also a kind of a bouncing tarantella for the aristocracy, and then a sort of Eastern European quasi Polish or quasi Bulgarian folk dance for the sort of commoners, the ordinary people. And so all of that melding together is where we ended up, and it ended up being a kind of wild and bizarre thing, and just way too much fun.
With which ensemble was it called recorded?
Oh, I recorded all over the place. I recorded a huge number of musicians in LA. The oboist who had played on Abzu, Kristen Nagus, she plays a lot of kind of penny whistle and recorder and instruments like that. She's based out of Florida. We recorded a string orchestra in Eastern Europe, and I'm trying to think what else. The score is kind of 4 scores in one. Each one was produced separately from the rest, so it's kind of all over the map.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Again, I'm a PC as a computer gamer, but I'm don't sit on a desk I sit on my bed and have my monitor in front of me, so it's like a couch.
Yeah.
And
understood.
And I love Assassin's Creed, and unfortunately I hadn't played Syndicate, but I'm looking forward to it. I'm still on Odyssey and love it.
Well, yes, Odyssey I thought was quite a tremendous piece, an achievement. They are pretty incredible games, and I felt very, very, very lucky to be part of it and to be able to play in that world, and to contribute my craziness.
I've listened to the music of Syndicate. It sounds very Victorian, and it's the right time. And how was your approach for that?
Well, it's funny because the goal was actually not to explicitly make something Victorian. It was to make something that felt dangerous and nimble, and the idea that it would be compatible with a Victorian sensibility was kind of secondary. I'm not a big fan of the idea that music has the job to offer the time and place of a story, like try to create the idea of, it takes place in the 1860s in London through the score, because I'm like, all you have to do is open your eyes. The game is screaming Victorian London everywhere you look. The music doesn't need to offer that. The music can offer something else. But if the music is compatible with that's a good thing. And so for me, it stemmed from this idea that the characters, there is a sarcastic quality to who they are. They never perceive themselves to be in danger. They are always very assured of their skills and their abilities, and I liked that idea that I could do again, it's sort of waltzes and dance music that could be the basis of all the combat in the game. I just thought it would be so wonderful and fun if they seem like they almost disrespect anybody that would be stupid enough to try and fight them. Because it's just too easy. And so that just kind of started from that perspective, and off it went. And I mean, it was a huge score. It was, something in the neighborhood of 3.5 hours of music. And so it's also very difficult to generalize about, but it was for such a big blockbuster title, it was amazingly free for me to experiment they were very encouraging of me just kind of doing what felt right, which I still to this day am kind of in shock over.
Wow. Yeah, as soon as possible, I renewed your Uplay Plus, and then I played.
Very good.
And then, listen to the music and dive into the London of the 1860s.
Well, thank you. I mean, it was a dream project. You know, it was just, I was able to work with Tina Guo once again and this fabulous violinist Sandy Cameron and write some really challenging and meaty solos for them and this wonderful orchestra in London. And I got to write original songs with three of my favorite people in the world, a comedy trio, sort of band / comedy act from Australia called Tripod. And the whole thing was just a dream. It was an absolute dream.
Wow. Yeah. I'm looking forward. Now about your current project, John Wick. With this project, you could work with Mike Bruchel again. How long you know in each other, and what was your first project?
Well, so actually, this was our first project together, but we had been friends for a couple of years. You know, initially just acquainted through Twitter. Basically, he knew my work and I knew his work, and there seemed to be some kind of mutual admiration and respect. And so I remember he had his first kind of big breakout hit game that that put his name on the map as a developer was called Thomas Was Alone. Beautiful music by a friend and colleague of mine named David Housden, a British composer. And Thomas Was Alone to me was just an absolutely spectacular game. I loved it to death. And so he became one of those guys I just dreamt of working with as a result. And then I really enjoyed his subsequent games. In particular, he made two very short, kind of succinct text adventure games called Subsurface Circular and Subsurface Quarantine that I thought were really wonderful and surprising. And we saw each other literally at a beach party in Croatia at a games conference, and just were chatting, and then sort of followed up, and he said, I'm working on something that I'd love to talk to you about. And I was immensely excited at the prospect of working together. And then he told me what it was, and he said it's actually an adaptation of John Wick, or it's actually not adaptation. It's not the right word. It is part of the John Wick universe, but it's technically a prequel to the first movie, and a little bit of backstory into who John Wick is prior to trying to retire and get a dog. And it was really, really exciting because it was a strategy game, a turn-based, quasi-turn-based strategy game, very unique mechanic and a very unusual way to approach John Wick. And I just thought, this is just crazy exciting. I am so on board. Wow. And so off we went.
I watched the video about it. It's a real game graphic.
How do you mean?
You made a kind of a music video.
Yeah. I mean, it's all recreated from the game. Yeah. It's just a bit of fun, basically. But that is how the game looks. I mean, you can see in that video the actual gameplay as well, and they try to be pretty faithful to it.
It looks like an adventure from LucasArts. So, yeah.
Yeah, far more violent than those.
Well.
But I suppose, yeah. I mean, it really is a strategy game, though. It's all about plotting your move. The way they described it is it's almost like trying to imagine what it's like to be the stunt coordinator for these movies, because you're essentially trying to think several seconds ahead in a way that moves very, very fast.
Wow.
So yeah, it was great fun and able to get. He was very open, and so was Lionsgate and everybody else involved to let me get very kind of experimental with it, which was fun because Tyler Bates, who's a friend of mine, had scored the films, and I said, do we want to be similar to that, or do we want to do our own thing? And they said, well, why don't we start similar and then let the game kind of evolve away from it? And so the first, little bit of the score is kind of intentionally an homage to the sound that Tyler had crafted for the movies, and then it gets further and further and further away from that, and it was really very fun.
Oh. Was there a special challenge for you when composing the music?
I mean, every project is. Nothing is ever easy. And so, I wouldn't say that this one was any more challenging than any other. It was equally as challenging as they always are.
You seem that you're crazy in the video game business. Does the work in this business appeal you more than ever, or has it simply not happened so often that you could also a film or series?
Well, funny enough, I've scored more movies than I have games. They're just independent films you never heard of, but I've scored something like 53 or 54 feature films, and like hundreds of short films. But I've scored somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 35 or 40 games. And it's not that I like one more than the other. I do love the technical challenges and the creative challenges related to the technical challenges of games a lot. To me, the idea of creating interactive narrative experiences there's no comparison to that anywhere other than, maybe the world of immersive theater, because films are passive experiences. They are not interactive experiences. And that interactivity to me is a storytelling form that is new, and I think will be the main way people experience stories in the 21st century. And I feel very, very excited to be part of the kind of front lines or the cutting edge of that through the game industry. And so I wouldn't say I enjoy it more, but I love every inch of it, and I'm grateful that I have as many opportunities as I have, because there's so many experiments I want to try, and this career in games gives me a chance to do that.
And you also seem to be at home at a concert hall. Is writing concert work something very special for you? And how do you approach this work?
I have always loved that. Before I had the opportunity to write any kind of scores, that was all I could do. And so, like most composers, I was writing music kind of for myself when I was younger, and I never wanted to give that up. My feelings on it has evolved a lot, because I used to be very passionate about wanting to, write a symphony, write a traditional opera, write a string quartet. And I'm less interested in that these days, because I think those forms are less exciting to me. But there are new forms that are exciting. And I really I also like creating large scale works. For example, last year I premiered a piece called A Light in the Void, which is an evening length show. It's a full on, the piece is an entire concert like an opera would be, except it's not an opera or anything like that. It's sort of a hybrid of a TED conference and a symphony, because it's a series of scientists on stage giving essentially presentations about their works set to music, and then interwoven with a theater piece. So we'll have actors sort of acting out a narrative and then having these visions in the form of a 20-minute science presentation. And the whole thing is set to music nonstop. So it's, it's almost 2 hours of music all set on stage in a concert hall. And that to me was a really exciting and it opened up my mind a lot, and very, very gratifying experience. And so that kind of thing I pursue more and more, like the thing I mentioned a minute ago with performing in Poland. That was similarly, we structured that as a concert that we called a Symphony of the Desert, which is the idea is that it was built around the music of Journey, but it was excerpts from all my works kind of stitched together into a sort of narrative. And so I would constantly turn and tell the audience about sort of my adventures as a composer, and it became a single piece as a result, like a 5-movement symphony that lasted for 90 minutes. And so, yeah, I really enjoy those kinds of things. But at the same time, in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, I have a premiere with the Mobile Symphony in Alabama here in the U.S. Of a traditional concert work, that's inspired by the Mercury program, and Alan Shepard sending the first first American into space. And it's just a traditional concert work inspired by that idea that I got while touring the Kennedy Space Center this past summer. So I still do dabble in that space, and I probably always will when the opportunity arises.
Mm-hmm. Wow, sounds great. I've read that you give lessons at schools and events. You also often do workshops. I like that you want to help others to fulfill their dreams. Do you have any tips for my listeners when they want to become composers?
You are definitely correct. I love giving back to the community. I've been very lucky in my career. A lot of composers were very generous with me when I first started, and it's very important to me to uphold that. Plus, I just enjoy it. I enjoy having public conversations about the artistic process and about curiosity and discovery and all of that sort of thing. And so, yeah, I always on the road, giving lectures or participating in panel discussions with colleagues of mine or whatever the case. In terms of advice that I might offer, the number one advice that I've kind of settled on over the years of thinking about this is to encourage composers to be divisive. Don't be afraid to have to make bold moves with your music and to have controversial opinions, because I think a lot of composers, especially early, are so afraid that they might turn people away and they'll therefore lose professional opportunities, that they don't really speak their mind and they don't really let themselves become themselves. But like so many other things, it's sort of like a muscle you have to practice, and you have to work. And if you are really used to just saying things shallowly all the time, where you're just trying to make people like you, you kind of forget what it sounds like to be yourself. And I encourage composers as early in their career as possible to really embrace all the things that make them them, knowing that, yes, that is going to close doors. That is going to take some people and make them turn away from you because they're just not interested anymore. But it will also make people turn towards you. It will give you opportunities that you wouldn't have known about, because there will be people who are drawn towards those opinions and towards those aesthetics and those creative ideas that they would never have known about if you were shy and quiet the whole time, as is often our instinct. So that to me is, if I could help composers sort of believe in themselves at all, that's always the one hope that I would say I have.
Mm-hmm. So instead of be the next Hans Zimmer, you say be the first you.
I couldn't put it better than that.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, and more composers should listen to that.
I agree. The world already has a Hans Zimmer. Like, we don't need another Hans Zimmer, you know, and the world doesn't need another John Powell or you know, Chris Lennertz or John Bryan or it goes on and on and on. There's you know, those voices are now taken, and be yourself. And the composers I admire the most, that tends to be what they have in common. You know, for example, Gareth Coker is a good example. He's a colleague and friend and very well known and respected in games, and he has a sensibility that is entirely his own. Or Jessica Curry, probably my favorite composer inspiration in games today. She's got just absolutely gorgeous sensibility to her writing, and no one sounds like her. Or, you know, the master of horror scores, although he's capable of so much more. Jason Graves, another composer I admire the hell out of. All these people, they sound like themselves, and that's why I love them.
Mm-hmm. Personally, I would say, the next Jerry Goldsmith would be nice. But Marco Beltrami does that very good. So.
Yeah, I think Marco is a very good composer. For me, if I had to pin one person as the sort of heir to the throne of Goldsmith, it's John Powell, because for me, Powell has his own voice, but he's also he's very versatile. You know, one of the Jerry hallmarks was that he could write in seemingly any genre and not really lose his voice. He could pivot from something very informed by pop music to this almost avant-garde, you know, modernist music, to something very lyrical and beautiful, to something very strange and experimental, or something very, you know, funk or jazz, or, I mean, it goes on and on and on and on and on and on, and yet it always sounded like Jerry. It never stopped being Jerry, and that to me is the real key, because if someone says, "Oh, I know how to write pop music," and they put on their pop music hat, they suddenly stop sounding like themselves. They just sound like generic pop music all of a sudden. And he always managed to transcend that. And John Powell is one of the very, very few that seems to be equally versatile and yet also never loses himself in the process. He's also just an incredibly innovative composer, and his he learned a lot of production magic from his time in the remote control Hans Zimmer world. or I guess back in those days, the media ventures world. And but he has developed techniques entirely his own, but he's also he grew up as a viola player. He's a very classically trained musician, and so he can really write traditionally if he needs to, and yet he can also bring a whole host of very modern and contemporary tricks, and above all, he can write a great tune. That's the kind of the secret thing that gets easily dismissed. Jerry really had a great melodic sense, and he wrote some truly extraordinary melodies, and so is John Powell. So to me, there's kind of no contest. He's the best around at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love his animation scores, and I love how happy they sound. It's you hear them and you have instantly good mood.
He said that actually. He said that deliberately. He doesn't really score non-animated films anymore, mm-hmm. and when someone asked him why, and he said, because I can write music that's full of joy, mm-hmm. For animated films, and not feel like I'm being ironic. I can be genuinely joyful. And where else can you do that? And he's right. Even games, it can be tricky.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I also love his dramatic scores like P.S. I Love You, or I'm Sam.
Not to mention I Am Sam is lovely, but not to mention the Bourne Identity. I mean, he basically created a whole new paradigm in action music that has been just ceaselessly stolen from since then. And it was a classic story that he developed that sound because they didn't have any budget anymore. They could only hire a string orchestra because they had fired Carter Burwell off of that movie and used all the budget in the process. So he had to figure out how to make something that was much more minimal, and then he made something new as a result. To me, he's just absolutely brilliant, and he's a very charming and funny guy. Also, I really like him.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to meet him very, very short in Ghent to get an autograph.
Oh, great!
So, he seems nice, and I hope I could speak with him in the future.
Yeah, I should definitely interview him.
Mm-hmm. And back to you. What is for you the fascination of music?
Well, I often like to say that music stands apart from every other art form because whereas all arts are a demonstration of humanity's brilliance and our creativity with what we can invent, we invented architecture, we invented theater, we invented filmmaking and game design and writing novels, and all these incredible art forms they are testimony to our creative inventiveness as a species. Music appears to be outside of that. I would say more accurately, we discovered music, and it seems to already exist. So much of the so-called rules of music are about its relationship to natural acoustic physics, which are going to be true throughout the cosmos, unless there's, for some reason, areas of the universe where the rules of physics somehow apply differently, which is hard to imagine. It seems that music has some certain true universalities in the actual sense of that word. And that makes it very mysterious as well, because it seems to be woven in with the fabric of reality in a way that physics is woven in with. Physics is just a description of the fabric of reality. Music seems to be a kind of byproduct of it in a way that really makes it apart from all the rest. And I think that may be why it seems to have a line of communication with our innermost selves that bypasses the intellect. It goes straight for the kind of most primal and core parts of who we are, distinct from all other arts, which often appeal to our mind and then kind of it gets passed along to our heart, as it were. Music seems to have a straight, direct route to our heart, and I think that it's part of just the fact that it's part of nature itself, as we are. And that, to me, makes it wonderfully exciting and also very kind of mysterious and beautiful as we continue to explore what all that means and our relationship to it. So it's kind of a lifelong quest, and that's endlessly appealing to me.
And so, what would you say is composing an art or a craft?
Well, I think the distinction between those is often a kind of irrelevant semantics, but to me, craft just means skill. and all art is improved by having greater skill. So you can create art through craftsmanship, and you can also sometimes even create art. You get lucky, and there are works that the artist had actually comparatively weak craftsmanship, but they just followed an instinct, and they have very good instincts. So to me, it becomes a kind of a nebulous wading into the weeds. I definitely think that to the extent that we would put art above craft, the distinction is meaningless, because I don't think that going into it, the premise needs to be loaded in that way. And by that I mean, if someone says, well, look, I'm just a craftsman, like I just make plates all day. I work with porcelain and I make plates. I'm not an artist. I would say, well, actually, I disagree. But maybe your goal is not to create some transcendent work of art in the manner of, a Verdi opera, but you're still creating something. You are still an artisan of some kind. And why would we limit your potential by saying, no, it's just a craft? So for me, all act of creating that humans engage in is some form of artistry. I would not pretend that the results are all equal, but the starting position is equal for me.
Wow. What do you think is the best thing about composing?
Oh, I don't know. I think probably I've tapped on that. I think with all my previous answers, it's just a fantastic way to make one's living. I can add though that for me the single greatest joy of this career is who I end up getting to work with. Like we mentioned Mike Bithell, or we mentioned Andy Schatz from Tooth and Tail, or Matt Nava from Abzu in our current game, The Pathless, or Genova Chen, Kelly Santiago, Robin Hunnicky, and all the rest from that game company on Journey and on Flow. And for me, the who is always far more important than the what of a project. And so, to me, composing as a kind of social activity, even if the social aspect means, the employer I've been hired by, that's just the best. I absolutely love that.
And is there something that makes it, perhaps less fun for you?
Well, it obviously comes with completely ludicrously huge amounts of doubt and self-criticism, and that can be very arduous. There's a great quote by a writer who once said, "I don't enjoy writing, I enjoy having written." And I relate to that a lot. Sometimes the act of composing is very painful, and I find myself hating it. But I love the finished product. I love having written something, and I love everything that comes once it's finished. So it can be very painful at times. But obviously it's been worth it for me to keep doing it and to basically plan to do it for my entire life.
Wow, sounds great. Can you tell us something about your next projects?
Well, as usual, as you probably are aware, most of it is veiled in secrecy. However, as I mentioned, Matt Nava, the creator of Abzu, we are working on our next project and nearing the finish line. That's called The Pathless. And the trailer is already out there, and you can see all about it. And I'm also working on a video game musical, an interactive musical where the music itself is interactive. Wow. That is currently finishing a crowdfunding campaign on Fig. It has less than a week to go. And I'm working on that with some truly phenomenal talents from the game industry. It's called Chorus, and it's kind of a modern twist on the Greek god pantheon, and very, very, very fun, and very excited about that. So Pathless, I believe, will be out in 2020. Chorus could be quite a while. We're barely getting started.
Wow. Musical and game. That sounds great. I love musicals. And
yeah, likewise. And there have been a couple of noble efforts at musicals, but none that have the degree of interactivity that we're aspiring to here. So it's very exciting.
Yeah, I'm looking forward. And one more little thing, almost the end. I count 5 terms and you tell me, what comes to your mind.
Okay.
Film music.
Well, I guess I would have to be loyal to Jerry and just say, if you say film music, the synonym is Jerry Goldsmith.
Orchestra.
I have no idea why, but the word Europe was the first thing that came to mind. I guess because that's the birthplace of the orchestra.
Mm.
Could also be I was thinking about this concert that we just did in Poland, so I'm probably biased.
Mm. Wow. Video games?
Again, you may have planted the seed, but if you say video games, I think LucasArts. And for me, the LucasArts adventure games are just, they set the bar for video games in the 90s, and Grim Fandango remains, for me, maybe my favorite game ever made.
Hollywood.
Well, it's funny. I went straight back to Jerry Goldsmith, but I'll give you a different answer, even though this is a weird one. But for me, the name that comes to mind is Leonard Bernstein. And ironically, he wasn't a huge fan of Hollywood. He only did one film score, and it wasn't a particularly positive experience for him, which was On the Waterfront, the Marlon Brando film. But I do love that old-fashioned Hollywood sensibility, the idea that we're going to tell stories that are larger than life, and it's going to dazzle, and it's going to entertain. And like, I love this era that we're in with Netflix and Amazon creating all these wonderful and intimate experiences. But to me, when I think of Hollywood, I think of like Lord of the Rings, just grand spectacles where they do a premiere at the Chinese Man Theater and they have spotlights rotating in the air like on the 20th Century Fox logo. And I love that. I love that 20th century, the glamour, the larger than life. And Leonard Bernstein to me is kind of the single person that epitomizes that, someone who just seemed to be superhuman. And that to me, that's the best of what Hollywood can be. It's like Star Wars events, grand spectacles. And I love that.
Oh.
Like the circus in the best way.
Wow. And yeah, the last one, hobbies.
Well, my favorite hobby, I think, that comes to mind, even though I haven't done it in a number of years, is scuba diving. I love exploring the ocean floor, and I've been dying to get back to it. So that'll be my answer there.
Wow. And yeah, that was it. And yeah, thank you for the time and your time and the interview.
My pleasure.